Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Saturday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service. It's the 5th of July. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather information by going to weather.gov/Alaska, giving us a call on the weather info line at 800-472-0391, or use social media and keep up to date with some of the things happening between the Alaska Weather Show on Twitter, on Facebook, or on YouTube. Of course, in the afternoon, you get your daily afternoon map briefing around 4 o'clock or so on YouTube. If you search for NWS Anchorage or NWS Fairbanks, you'll get the map briefing that way. Or if you wait till after the show and you'd like to see the entirety of the program that you're watching right now, but you missed a little piece of it or you missed the entire thing, you can go to alaskapublic.org, our broadcast partner here, or go on YouTube and type in the search bar AKWX TV and then subscribe to that channel, and then you'll always have the very latest weather information, including that 30-minute show that you like to watch. Here's a look at Alaska weather headlines for the next couple days or so. Flooding concerns are easing in the interior and southeastern Alaska. In fact, only flood advisories remain at this point for areas around the mid-interior, around the Tanana Valley. Those flood advisories have been dropped up around Fort Yukon and westward toward Tanana itself. We'll look at those flood advisories here in just a moment. Record high today reached in Cold Bay, 65 degrees. The old temperature was 63 back in 1991, so we are affectionately calling Cold Bay Warm Bay for the rest of this afternoon and maybe the weekend as well. Another round of rains heading into the interior for the early part of the week. It may start up a little bit tomorrow and then crank up a little bit more as we head into Monday and Tuesday, thanks to another slug of moisture moving in from the Yukon. And we expect some late week changes for Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island, looking way out there toward Thursday and Friday. Another low is moving up from the Pacific and probably into the eastern part of the Bering and then eventually into the western Gulf. So we'll keep an eye on that. Here's a look at the hazardous weather now. As of this point, flood advisories are posted for areas around Fort Yukon and north of Fairbanks and also downstream from Fairbanks. There is kind of the residual flooding is still seeping out into the streams and rivers there. But the flood warnings have been dropped, not only there, but also for northern parts of southeast. Skagway has dropped now. So we're looking for improving conditions from this point out. Now, one thing to watch for as we go ahead into the early part of next week with another round of rain coming in from the east and into the interior on top of soggy conditions there that have been seen in recent weeks. We'll watch for flooding concerns again to see if things start to set up to bring flooding back to a higher level there or start the flooding at all. So keep watch on the weather systems, especially if you're in the central or eastern interior and upstream from Fairbanks or even around Fairbanks in the coming days there for the latest on that weather pattern. Fire danger is increasing, as you would expect, with temperatures in the upper 70s and lower 80s across a large part of Alaska. Things are moving back into high fire danger regions right now, and you'll notice around Fairbanks, of course, this big hole, certainly due to the very wet conditions that have been there. But westward, northward, and east, and even into the Kenai Peninsula, once again, fire danger starting to creep back up there. So always a good idea to be extra careful in Alaska. Here's a look at the Bering Sea satellite picture now, and you can see the main core of the jet stream snaking its way across the central and northern Pacific. We still have a very broad trough of low pressure across Alaska, and that is allowing that warm air to just sit and spin right across south central and southwestern Alaska and putting most of our region on Alaska's slow bake there. One thing that will be interesting to watch here, and you can't see this on the bottom of the screen, just barely a few clouds here, is a new tropical cyclone has developed. This is looking to take aim on Japan, and it's probably several days, maybe about a week out from being caught up to anywhere close to Alaska influence, but something to keep an eye on. It looks like a pretty healthy storm. We'll just have to see what kind of moisture it brings northward and if that can reach anywhere close to Alaska in the next 6 to 7 days. Here's a look at the visible satellite picture now, one of my favorites, and you can see just the amount of sunshine blasting Alaska this afternoon. Just a few fair weather cumulus here across the west so far, but we did have some thunderstorm activity around Lake Iliamna. And the overall circulation here had the densest amount of clouds across the eastern parts of the Copper River Basin around the Alcan border. And then also we saw some development around the Brooks Range across the west. Low clouds and fog. Stratus broke up a little bit, leaving more sunshine for places like Norton Sound and Bristol Bay. And then a very stable pattern, it looked like, out across the Aleutians. In fact, once again, in that stable pattern, you can see ship tracks here. A sign of pretty stable air that's not moving around too much. And for southeast, low pressure is working its way northward. About 0.2 of an inch of precipitation there around Ketchikan and maybe around the Annette area as well. It looked like precipitation really eased back a little bit today across southeast, so perhaps just what you needed there, especially in northern parts of southeast after some pretty soggy weather. Here's the loop one more time, and you can see a little more moisture here across the southern parts of the Yukon. That will be sliding westward as we head into the next 24 to 48 hours, and again, a better chance of rainfall there. Today's weather chart shows a trough of low pressure here. It's what we call a thermal ridge. A lot of heat building up across the interior. It gives us a broad area of low pressure, very close to the mountains. A trough of low pressure extends into the Gulf. With that, some areas of light rain across southern parts of southeast, and an occluded front that is trying as hard as it can to hold on, but it looks like this will be dying off in the pretty near term. And a weaker area of low pressure just south of the Gulf of Anadyr, and that very stable air mass that you can see again with the lines in the visible satellite picture there, thanks to the ships moving through the ocean. Tonight's forecast shows pockets of rainfall across southeast. It does not look like this will be tremendously heavy in any one spot. There will be a couple thunderstorms. If you look outside right now toward the Talkeetna Mountains, toward the Alaska Range, toward the Susitna Valley, or Mount Susitna itself, chances are you're looking at a pretty decent tower as of the 5:30 position anyway, if you're watching now. Out across the Bering, some areas of light rain, fog, and stratus there. Probably nothing too serious, but you may see diminished visibility as a result. The winds are not very strong. There are a couple places with small craft advisories. The winds are staying up right now across southeast and the northern Gulf, as well as some areas on the Arctic coast, but all areas should see diminishing wind as we get into Sunday. High pressure is trying to set up across areas just outside of Gustavus at 1,020 millibars. There's still a little bit of rain across southeast tomorrow, more in the light rain fashion, perhaps even showery at times. A better chance for showers in south central tomorrow, and probably looking at least widely scattered thunderstorms across parts of the Yukon Valley and along the western Alaska Range, maybe even north of the Yukon Valley up toward the Brooks Range by Sunday afternoon. Our trough in the west is staying put. Not really weakening, not really strengthening, and certainly not moving across the Bering. There, pockets of light rain, fog, and stratus are still possible, and maybe some afternoon showers for the central and western chain. The Alaska Range also could see a few showers as well. Some showers are along the Chukchi Seacoast, and what happens on Monday? Well, looks like that moisture is moving in and kind of condensing into parts of the central and eastern interior, the Susitna Valley, parts of Prince William Sound. Southeast, you're back in a little more widespread shower activity there. Still pretty light. Areas offshore might see a steadier rainfall. Kodiak Island looks like a wetter start to the week there, and showers across Bristol Bay and parts of the YK into Norton Sound. Right now, Nome's looking a little bit on the drier side, but it'll be close. And here's a slug of moisture and warmer air trying to work its way up out of the North Pacific. We'll keep an eye on that. In the meantime, a ridge of high pressure out of the Pacific Northwest is pushing a lot of this moisture further and further north and working to draw in moisture across the eastern parts of the interior there. So something to watch. Looking at temps today, a milder day for southeast, 50s and 60s there. Looked like Juneau was in the lower 60s by late afternoon. Yakutat, low 60s for you. Annette and Ketchikan holding in the 50s. Hyder was 63. Prince William Sound saw temps in the 50s and 60s. Anchorage well above the 70-degree mark today. Talkeetna 84. Look at the interior, low to mid 80s there. A scorcher of a day for folks along the Tanana Valley. 81 in Fairbanks at least, 75 for Yukon. Looking further north still, the Arctic coast in the 50s and 60s. Away from the coastline itself, Atkasuk was 64 degrees, 52 around Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse, 45 in Kaktovik. 55 around Wainwright. Kotzebue Sound closing in on 60 degrees there for Kivalina, 56 in Kotzebue, 52 for Shishmaref, 56 in Nome, and 48 around Gamble. Norton Sound temperatures were holding in the 60s to low 70s there if you got away from the water a little bit. Areas around Ruby and Galena saw temps in the 70s and 80s. McGrath was 83, 68 in Bethel, 54 in Nunivak Island. The YK generally in the mid to upper 50s today. Dillingham saw temperatures closer to 64 with King Salmon at 67 degrees. And Lake Iliamna and areas much closer to the western side of the Alaska Range were closing in on those low 80s, helping to pop those showers and storms again. Kodiak was 59. The Alaska Peninsula in the 50s and 60s with Sandpoint at 59. Cold Bay and False Pass also in the mid 60s. And again, as we said, Cold Bay made it up to 65 degrees, I believe, today, a new record. Low 50s for the Pribilofs, 48 for Atka. Adak was a much warmer 54 degrees, and Attu was showing 48. Overnight low temperatures will hold in the 50s for a large part of the YK, the interior, and the middle Tanana Valley. Fort Yukon looking at 58. Fairbanks not too far behind. Southeast low to mid 50s. Prince William Sound closer to 50 degrees. Kodiak Island about the same. 40s and 50s for the chain. The Arctic coast a little bit closer to the 40 degree mark, and Nome about 48. With high temperatures there tomorrow closing in on 70. In the interior, it'll look like west to east, temps could go above the 80 degree mark very easily. South central, generally in the mid to upper 60s. Southeast, upper 60s in some cases. Even Juneau, Annette, Ketchikan, and Sitka could all be in the mid 60s tomorrow. Kodiak looking at 58, upper 50s and lower 60s for the Alaska Peninsula. Nunivak Island 51, Bethel 73, and Nome again around 68 degrees with Barrow close to 50. Showers and storms could be widely scattered across the interior and the Yukon Valley as well as the Kuskokwim Valley tomorrow, but the best threat for IFR probably along the Arctic coast, maybe along the western tip of the Seward Peninsula and most of the Bering as well as the chain and perhaps the eastern side of Kodiak Island. Otherwise, MVFR conditions out over the water. VFR conditions should prevail for Anaktuvik, Adigan Pass, as well as Lake Clark and Merrill Pass with thunderstorms possible there, and for Rainy Pass. Windy Pass we expect to see VFR. Same goes for Isabel Pass throughout the day. Mentasta Pass should be visual throughout the day with showers and storms developing. Tanita Pass could see VFR, and it looks like Portage Pass and the Chilkoot and White passes are all expected to be VFR throughout the day. Not too hard to figure out the warm weather pattern with 10,000-foot freezing levels across the interior there. That may help to get some thunderstorms started. But again, once we get all this warm air in here, at some point it actually stops making thunderstorms possible by placing a lid or a cap on the atmosphere, making it hard for those to get started. Once they do, they can rip, roar, and get going. But sometimes it's just a little bit too warm to get those thunderstorms started very easily. You can see the warmer air also invading in from the west there, with colder air wrapping into the Gulf of Alaska. Tomorrow's icing potential, of course, could be isolated severe near any thunderstorms that do develop. Keep that in mind as always. Out over the Bering, above 6,000 but below 12,000 feet for St. Matthew and probably areas close to the Pribilofs and some pockets of light isolated moderate out over the Gulf. The jet stream shows a digging area of low pressure across the Gulf, but we have high pressure keeping that warm air circulating right over the mainland. Just to the south of that, a ridge building over the Pacific Northwest is keeping things moving across the continental 48 states, and low pressure is strengthening out across the western Pacific. At 9,000 feet, you can see our elongated trough of low pressure. It doesn't look terribly strong, but it sure is keeping things at status quo right now. A southerly flow across south central. Winds are light across the interior thanks to high pressure. Wind speeds there only around 10 to 20 knots, and we see a similar pattern with 5 to 10 knot winds coming in from the western Yukon and our area of low pressure here across the southern Gulf, guiding in southerlies into southeast around 10 to 20 knots, and winds very light over the Bering with the strongest winds south of the chain at 10 to 25 knots. Turbulence shouldn't be much of an issue tomorrow, but areas in the northern Gulf above 1,000 feet could see some light to isolated moderate, and mainly along the Arctic coast from 3 to about 5,000 feet and below, and of course in the vicinity of any thunderstorms present. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with your marine weather forecast here in just a few minutes.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm Jim Peranto. Today in the studio I have Tina Neal, who's a geologist at the Alaska Volcano Observatory, or AVO, and today Tina is going to familiarize us with the AVO and tell us why the AVO is so important to Alaska. Welcome, Tina.
Thank you, Jim.
First off, what is the AVO and who works there?
Okay. Well, the Alaska Volcano Observatory is a joint scientific program comprised of the U.S. Geological Survey, the University of Alaska Fairbanks Geophysical Institute, and the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys. So it's a group effort, and our job is primarily to track the activity of active volcanoes in Alaska and, importantly, give warning when they are becoming restless or getting ready to erupt.
What are the primary objectives of the AVO, and how do you go about meeting those objectives?
The primary objectives are threefold. First is to track these active volcanoes and monitor their state of activity so that we can issue alerts and warnings when they become restless and look like they're threatening to erupt. Secondly, we try to assess the likely future eruptive scenarios at these volcanoes and what sorts of hazards and effects could be associated with these eruptions. And then thirdly, we spend a lot of our time conducting basic scientific research into the processes of volcanism, and this is important to understanding better how our planet works and also to improve our ability to forecast eruptions.
And you have equipment that monitors these volcanoes across the state?
We do.
Okay.
The primary means for tracking activity at volcanoes worldwide is the use of seismometers, or basically earthquake sensing devices. And so we have more than 120 of these devices spread out across the volcanic arc of Alaska. On each active volcano, we have a network of about 5 or 6 of these seismometers that ring the volcano. And it's those sensors that are constantly listening to the volcano, basically, to pick up earthquake or other ground vibration activity that could mean the volcano is restless.
Okay. Now, why is the AVO so important to the pilots and other Alaskans up here? As you know, we have a huge aviation community up here in Alaska, so it's got to be particularly important to them.
You're absolutely right. One of the primary reasons for AVO being here and for growing through the years as we have is that there is such a huge aviation component to life and commerce in Alaska. And the Alaskan type of volcanoes tend to be explosive. That means their eruptions often produce towering columns of ash that can rise 30, 40, 50, 60,000 feet into the sky in a matter of minutes and produce these ash clouds that drift many hundreds or thousands of miles downwind. So those become a severe hazard to aviation of all kinds, low altitude traffic as well as the high altitude jet traffic. So one of our main jobs is to work to get information about these eruptions quickly into the aviation communication stream so that pilots and aircraft can avoid areas of danger.
About, I don't know if this is correct or not, but about half the population in Alaska live near an active volcano. Is that right?
That's right. About half the state of Alaska's population is within 200 miles of an active volcano. Of course, that's here in south central Alaska and includes the valley and Anchorage and the Kenai Peninsula. We're just downwind directly of Mount Spur, Redoubt, Iliamna, Augustine, all the volcanoes close to us that have been historically active in one way or another and could produce eruptions that at least drop ash on the populated communities of South Central.
So it's important not only to pilots, but just people in general.
Sure, sure. Even folks on the ground 100 miles away from a volcano need to be prepared and know what to do should there be ash coming out of the sky.
How many volcanoes do we have up here in Alaska?
I like to say we have 41 active volcanoes, and by active we mean volcanoes that have had either an eruption or some significant unrest, earthquake activity or a large steam cloud production in the last 200 years, 250 years or so. That's our definition of active volcanoes.
Okay.
If you expand the time frame to look back at the last 10,000 years or so, the number may jump to 80 or 90 separate volcanic centers. So different geologists count the volcanoes slightly differently, but I think it's suffice it to say that Alaska is a very volcanically active region on the planet.
And why do we have so many volcanoes up here?
Well, it's a result of a planetary process that we call subduction, and this is one of the tenets of plate tectonic theory that's developed in the last quarter century in geological sciences. And subduction is a process whereby the outer rigid portions of the Earth's surface, which are broken up into about a dozen major plates, subduction occurs when these plates come together and meet, and one is actually forced downward below another. So you have an overriding plate and an underriding plate.
Okay.
And in Alaska setting, it's the North Pacific or the Pacific Plate, which is diving beneath mainland Alaska and the North American Plate. As that downgoing material, which you can envision in your mind's eye just like a conveyor belt descending into the Earth's interior, reaches a depth of about 100 kilometers or 60 miles, the temperature and physical changes occur such that melting of the material in that region occurs. And the molten material that results is called magma and is lighter, less dense than the rocks around it, and it tends to rise to the surface of the Earth. And where that material punctures the surface of the Earth, you have a volcano. So along this subduction boundary where the two plates are meeting in Alaska, which basically parallels the Aleutian Arc, that's why we have this line of volcanoes. That same process of subduction and the two great plates meeting is also why we have such an earthquake active region here and why Alaska is so seismically busy.
And it's part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, right?
Exactly. It's the northern arc of the Pacific Ring of Fire.
So subduction's happening all across the Pacific?
Basically all around the Pacific Basin, exactly. It's responsible for the volcanoes of South America, Central America, Indonesia, Japan, and Kamchatka.
Okay. One more question. How does the AVO work with other government agencies?
It's a really important part of the warning process that the Alaska Volcano Observatory work closely with the National Weather Service, Federal Aviation Administration, and other agencies at the state and federal level to be able to distribute these warnings in a very timely and accurate fashion. So our job is to communicate immediately with FAA and Weather Service when we either see a volcano becoming restless or we are certain an eruption has occurred. And we try to give them as much data, hard facts about what's going on as possible, so they can translate that information into their formal notification stream of SIGMETs, NOTAMs, volcanic ash advisories, and other message formats that I'm sure the pilot community is very familiar with. So we work very closely with those groups, Anchorage Center and the Aviation Weather Unit and other people in town. We meet with them several times a year to make sure our communication lines are open. And in addition to that, the observatory puts out both an email and text fax message when we have a volcanic event of any kind. And this can go to the public and the media. It's also available on our webpage. So we try to get information out along a number of redundant pathways to make sure it's as disseminated as widely as possible.
Well, folks out there want to get more information about volcanoes. There's some useful websites out there. There's one that talks about volcano preparedness, another one about volcanic ash, I believe, and then there's one that is for the Anchorage Volcanic Ash Advisory Center, which is part of the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit. And that might be some useful information to people out there. Of course, they can always contact you, Tina. You work right here in Anchorage.
Absolutely. We have an office up on the APU campus in Gould Hall, and we're always delighted to receive visitors, especially folks from the aviation community, because pilots are really our eyes in the sky many times. And I've been here for 14 years, and on many occasions, in the old days especially, the first indication of an eruption actually came from a pilot who saw it from the air. So we really appreciate that relationship and welcome visits or calls at any time.
Well, that's great. Boy, a lot of great information today. Thank you for coming in.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for joining us here on Alaska Weather Facts. Until next time.
Thanks, Jim and Tina. Here's a look at the forecast for Southeast for Sunday. A stronger southeasterly wind in the morning. Some of that will be diminishing during the day. The inner waterways looking at winds from 10 to 15 knots, 2 to 3 foot seas on the inside, and anywhere from 8 to 11 foot seas on the inside. But again, some of that will be diminishing during the day, and you can see by Monday much more improved conditions with 10 to 15 knots from the south and east. 4 to 5 foot seas along the coast and in the inner waterways, 2 to 3 foot seas with more of a north and northeasterly flow from Stevens Passage and Frederick Sound northward, and more of a southeasterly wind continuing around Ketchikan and Metlakatla. 25 knot winds there with a 3 foot sea. For south central, a southerly flow in the Cook Inlet, 15 knot winds there with 4 foot sea. More of an east and southeasterly flow coming over the Barrens and the southern tip of the Kenai between 15 and 20 knots. On either side of Kodiak Island, we have a northeasterly wind in Chillicothe, an onshore easterly flow into Kodiak at a 15 knot wind with a 5 foot sea, and east and northeasterly winds around the northern Gulf. Again, these will be the strongest probably in the morning, picking up tonight actually with an easterly flow at 25 knots, 6 foot seas there in the north, and then diminishing a little bit there on Monday with an easterly wind continuing at 20 knots with an 8 foot sea. We'll see similar conditions outside of Resurrection Bay. 25 knots into the Barren Islands with 7 foot seas expected there, and we get more of a northerly flow across Cook Inlet at 10 knots with a 3 foot sea all the way down past Kenai. Across the Alaska Peninsula tomorrow, light and variable flow inside Bristol Bay and down along the coastline there for the Alaska Peninsula. Easterly south of Castle Cape into Chignik, 20 knots with a 5 foot sea, maybe a little bit stronger there east of the Shumagins. So we expect again some stronger winds, probably creating about 4 to 5 foot seas on the Pacific side. And then that diminishes as well. The winds also lessening somewhat as we get into Monday. An easterly flow at 15 knots with a 4 foot sea, and winds still pretty light across the Bering. Inside Bristol Bay, that turns to more of a southeasterly flow with a 1 foot sea, almost flat. Across the Aleutians, pretty light flow there for Sunday. North and westerly flow continues across Adak, Atka, Nikolsky, and more of a variable flow once you get out toward Unalaska there on either side of the eastern chain. 3 to 4 foot seas, more of a west and northwesterly flow across the western chain, 15 to 20 knots, becoming light and variable around Kiska. More of a northeasterly flow there out around Attu with a 3 foot sea, and we're still maintaining light, if not variable winds on the north and south side of the central and eastern chain with 3 to 4 foot seas on the Pacific side and 2 to 3 foot seas on the Bering side for Monday. Across the west coast now, northerlies coming up from St. Lawrence Island. Look like 3 foot seas there. It continues into Nunivak Island, diminishes somewhat into Kuskokwim Bay, and more of a variable and light flow around the Pribilofs with a 2 foot sea there and for the St. Matthew Island waters. By Monday, those northerlies are picking up a little bit more coming out of the Bering Strait. 5 foot seas expected there. Anywhere else, though, 2 to 3 foot seas south of Hooper Bay into Kuskokwim Bay. We start to develop a southerly flow. That's still pretty light with a 2 foot sea. And across the Arctic coast, easterlies continue with small craft advisories in some cases there. 4 foot seas north of Kaktovik with some open water there. Not a whole lot yet, but it is happening. And northerly flow west of Barrow all the way into Kotzebue Sound at 10 to 15 knots. Seas running around 3 to 4 feet. And for Monday, northeasterlies pick up a little bit more from Barrow, still around 10 knots. But once you get out around Wainwright and south, that's up to 20 knots with 5 to 6 foot seas. And east to northeasterly winds will continue across the Beaufort Seacoast with a 3 foot sea north of Kaktovik. Recapping tonight's weather, most areas are going to be dry. A lot of dry and very warm air continues across the mainland of Alaska. Widely scattered thunderstorms may be possible around some of the higher terrain for the Alaska Range, the Talkeetnas, and eastward into the Copper River Basin, where they may be even more isolated. Look for light rainfall to continue across some parts of the southern 2/3 of southeastern Alaska. A weak occluded front sits even further south of Haida Gwaii. That's trying to fall apart, but it is sending moisture up the southeastern coast. Light areas of rain and drizzle are possible across the Bering, as well as the chain with pockets of fog there. Showers across the Chukchi Seacoast may develop as we get into Sunday. A better chance for thunderstorms up and down the Yukon tomorrow. Watch for that. And a few of those areas might have some brief but heavy rain with it. A much better chance of heavier rainfall, perhaps some cases up to an inch under some of those thunderstorms and showers across the interior as we get into Monday with a wetter pattern shaping up for many in the mainland. Thanks for watching, Alaska.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.